Mount Rushmore is one of the most iconic monuments in the United States, but there's a lot more going on behind those stone faces than most people realize. Located in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the site is part of territory that was guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. But that treaty was later violated when gold was discovered nearby. The Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota, so they went to court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1980 that the land was taken illegally. The ruling awarded financial compensation, which the tribe refused, insisting on the return of the land instead. They didn't get it. In addition to the issue of land rights, some have a problem with the presidents featured on the monument. Two of the four presidents, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, enslaved people. And to add icing on the controversy cake, the monument's sculptor, Gutzon Borglum, had previously worked on the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial in Georgia, which we'll talk about later, and had ties to the Ku Klux Klan. His involvement adds an additional layer of criticism surrounding the monument's origins and intent. In the late 1800s, King Leopold II of Belgium set out to build an empire, but not for his country. He claimed the Congo Free State as his personal possession, independent of the Belgian government. It was the largest privately owned colony in modern history. Leopold promised to bring civilization and Christianity to Central Africa, but in practice, his regime extracted rubber and ivory through forced labor, backed by a brutal quota system. Villages that resisted saw hostages taken, homes burned, and, in some cases, limbs amputated as punishment. Reports from missionaries and photos taken by colonial agents themselves documented the abuses. So many people lost their lives that population estimates dropped by millions over just a few decades, though exact numbers remain debated due to incomplete records. Back in Belgium, Leopold was praised as a modernizer. He used the profits from Congo to fund public buildings, monuments, and urban renewal in Brussels and other cities. Statues went up across the country. But as more of Congo's history came to light in the 20th century, those statues became targets of protest. In 2020, amid global demonstrations over racism and colonial legacies, several were vandalized, removed, or boxed up. Some Belgians argue that removing the statues erases history, but others say public honor and historical record aren't the same thing, and that monuments in shared spaces should reflect shared values. For over a century, Christopher Columbus was celebrated across the Americas as the man who discovered the New World. His name appeared on cities, streets, schools, and statues were erected in parks and plazas from the U.S. to Argentina. He was especially embraced in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a symbol of Italian-American identity during a time when Italian immigrants faced widespread discrimination. But the version of Columbus taught in schools left out most of what happened after he arrived. On the island of Hispaniola, Columbus and his men enslaved indigenous people, imposed harsh tribute systems, and punished resistance with violence. Spanish officials even arrested him in 1500 after complaints from settlers and clergy about his governance. So, while Columbus became a hero to many generations, new scrutiny of primary sources, including his own journals, led to a growing movement to reevaluate how he's remembered. By the 2010s, protests were calling for his statues to come down. In 2020, amid broader protests over racial injustice, dozens of Columbus monuments were removed or toppled in cities like Boston, Richmond, and Bogota. Some defenders argue Columbus symbolizes global exploration and immigrant pride. But for critics, the statues mark the start of centuries of displacement, forced labor, and cultural erasure that followed. Across the United States, there are more than 1,200 public monuments dedicated to the Confederacy. These include statues of generals like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, along with memorial plaques, fountains, and obelisks scattered through town squares, state capitals, and courthouse lawns. Most weren't installed during or immediately after the Civil War. In fact, the majority were erected between the 1890s and 1950s, during the height of segregation laws and racial disenfranchisement in the South. Many were funded and promoted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization that also distributed school textbooks promoting the idea of the lost cause, a narrative that reimagined the Confederacy as noble and the practice of enslavement as a minor issue. The Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia, was installed in 1924, decades after the war. In 2016, city officials voted to remove it. The decision was challenged in court, and during the legal dispute, the statue became the focal point of the 2017 Unite the Right rally, where hundreds of white nationalist demonstrators gathered to oppose its removal. One counter-protester lost their life, and dozens were injured. In 2021, the statue was finally taken down. In 2023, it was melted down and repurposed into a new public artwork through a community-led initiative. Since 2015, over 300 Confederate monuments have been removed or relocated across the U.S., including in cities like New Orleans, Baltimore, Richmond, and Chapel Hill. At the same time, more than 20 states still have monuments or memorials in place, some protected by state laws that prohibit removal or alteration without legislative approval. For over a century, Edward Colston was remembered in Bristol as a philanthropist. His name was on schools, charities, and civic buildings. A statue was raised in his honor in 1895, nearly 2 centuries after his passing. Colston had donated heavily to local causes, but much of his fortune came from his role as a high-ranking official in the Royal African Company, which transported over 80,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Thousands lost their lives during the voyages. Those who did make it faced lifelong enslavement in British colonies. Historians and activists called for the statue's removal for years. But in June 2020, during worldwide protests following the untimely passing of George Floyd, demonstrators in Bristol pulled the statue down and pushed it into the harbor. The moment was filmed, shared globally, and debated across the UK. The statue was later retrieved and placed in the city's museum, still bearing the graffiti and damage from its fall. Its plinth remains empty. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo was established in 1869 to honor the over 2.4 million individuals who lost their lives in military service to the Japanese Empire, from the Meiji Restoration through World War II. But the controversy comes in because the list of those honored includes those responsible for some of the country's most violent wartime acts. 1,068 convicted war criminals, among them 14 Class A war criminals from World War II, figures tied to various atrocities. Regular visits to the shrine by high-ranking Japanese politicians, sometimes on war anniversaries, have drawn condemnation from China, South Korea, and others, who see these acts as political gestures that glorify atrocity rather than honor victims. Supporters of the shrine argue that it is a religious site, not a political one, and that honoring the fallen is distinct from endorsing their actions. On the site grounds, the Yasukuni War Museum presents Japan's wartime history in a way that omits or downplays key events, according to critics. Together, the shrine and its affiliated institutions remain central to ongoing disputes over how the war is remembered and who is remembered at all. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin's image appeared on coins, posters, and public monuments across the Soviet Union. Entire cities and streets were named after him, and statues of him were placed in nearly every major town. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of those statues came down. In Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, and other former Soviet republics, removing Lenin's image became part of the process of breaking from Moscow's influence. This movement was sometimes called decommunization. In Russia, though, many Lenin statues remained, and in some cases were restored. Some are still treated with reverence. Others have been vandalized or stand in disrepair. Interestingly, a few Lenin statues also exist in the U.S., placed by private collectors or as pieces of political art. In Seattle, for example, a Soviet-era Lenin statue stands in a public square, sparking occasional debate. Across former Soviet states, the statue's fate often tracks with the country's politics, whether they see Lenin as a liberator, a colonizer, or a relic best left in the past. John A. Macdonald was Canada's first prime minister and a key figure in the country's founding in 1867. He helped create the National Railway, expanded Canadian territory westward, and shaped the structure of its government. But he also designed and implemented the residential school system, where Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in church-run institutions. The goal was assimilation. Many children suffered harsh treatment, neglect, and lost their lives in custody. Thousands of unmarked graves have been identified in recent years. Macdonald's statues were once considered untouchable, but in the 2010s and 2020s, cities across Canada, including Victoria, Montreal, and Charlottetown, removed or relocated them following public pressure and protests. Some argue his role as a nation builder shouldn't be erased. Others say public monuments should reflect the full historical record, not just political achievements. The question isn't whether Macdonald is a part of Canadian history, it's whether he should still stand on a pedestal in the middle of it. After Spain's Civil War ended in 1939, General Francisco Franco ordered the construction of a massive memorial in the mountains outside Madrid. It would be called the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. The project began in 1940 and took nearly 20 years to complete. Much of the labor came from political prisoners, many of them from the defeated Republican side. The site includes a towering cross and an underground basilica carved directly into the rock. Franco said it was a memorial to all who lost their lives in the war, but the reality was lopsided. Most of those buried there fought for the fascist side. Over 33,000 bodies are interred, including thousands of Republicans moved there without family consent, sometimes without their knowledge. In 1975, after ruling Spain for nearly 4 decades, Franco himself was buried inside the basilica, elevating the monument into a shrine for his supporters. That status lasted until 2019, when his body was exhumed and reburied elsewhere after a lengthy political and legal battle. The monument is still funded by the Spanish government. Its future remains contested. In Georgia, not far from Atlanta, the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial shows 3 Confederate leaders, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, carved into the side of a mountain. It's the largest Confederate monument in the U.S., but it wasn't built right after the Civil War. The idea took shape in 1915, the same year the Ku Klux Klan held a revival ceremony on the mountain. That wasn't a coincidence. Early funding and planning had ties to white supremacist groups, and construction aligned with the rise of Jim Crow laws. But the carving itself wasn't finished until 1972, during the Civil Rights era. It was a decades-long project, backed by Georgia officials who saw it as a symbol of Southern identity. Unlike many Confederate statues that have been removed in recent years, Stone Mountain is protected by state law. There's a theme park at the base. It's not just the size that makes it controversial, it's the intention behind it, and the fact that it's still treated as a tourist attraction, not a historical site. Cecil Rhodes was a British imperialist who helped expand colonial rule in southern Africa in the late 1800s. He founded Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, served as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and built its wealth through diamond mining. He also supported policies that restricted black land ownership and political rights, ideas that directly influenced later development of apartheid. His name lives on through the Rhodes Scholarship, which brings students to Oxford University. But his public statues, especially the ones at the University of Cape Town and Oriel College, Oxford, have drawn growing criticism. In 2015, students in Cape Town launched the #RhodesMustFall movement. The statue there was removed after weeks of protest. The campaign then spread to Oxford, where protests and petitions pushed for the removal of the Oriel College statue. But Oxford's statue is still standing. In 2021, the college said it supported removal in principle, but logistical and legal hurdles stalled any action. In Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, a 279-foot statue towers over the battlefield where one of the bloodiest battles in World War II took place. It's called the Motherland Calls, and when it was completed in 1967, it was the tallest statue in the world. The statue commemorates the Battle of Stalingrad, where Soviet forces stopped the Nazi advance at a cost of over 1 million lives. The figure, a woman holding a sword aloft, was designed to evoke sacrifice, defiance, and national unity. For decades, the statue stood as a war memorial, but in recent years, it's also been used in state-sponsored messaging, featured in political rallies, military parades, and government media supporting Russia's actions in Ukraine and other regional conflicts. So while the statue still honors the past, its imagery is now tied to the present, where remembrance of victory is being used to justify new wars. In Arlington National Cemetery, a memorial was erected in 1914 to honor Confederate soldiers. It features a woman representing the South atop a pedestal, surrounded by symbolic figures, including an enslaved man following a white soldier into battle. The statue was designed by Moses Ezekiel, a Confederate veteran, and was part of a broader push in the early 20th century to promote reconciliation between the North and the South, but on terms that often minimized the role of enslavement in the war. For decades, the memorial received little public scrutiny. It stood on federal land in a cemetery known for honoring military service, not political ideology. But in recent years, attention turned to the statue's imagery and the way it depicted the Confederacy. In 2023, after a recommendation from the Congressional Naming Commission, the memorial was removed as part of a broader effort to eliminate Confederate symbols from Department of Defense property. At 49 meters tall, the African Renaissance Monument in Dakar, Senegal, is the tallest statue in Africa. It was unveiled in 2010, commissioned by then-President Abdoulaye Wade to symbolize post-colonial pride and a unified African future. The design features a muscular man holding a child in one arm and guiding a woman forward with the other. It was intended as a national landmark, a bold statement of independence and identity. But the project quickly drew criticism. It was built by a North Korean construction company, designed by a Romanian architect, and funded with over $27 million in public money, in a country where many lacked access to basic services. The statue's portrayal of the woman, with European facial features and a revealing outfit, also drew backlash from local religious leaders. What was meant to represent African pride became a subject of debate about corruption, cultural authenticity, and priorities in public spending. During World War II, tens of thousands of women across Asia, from Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, were forced into military-run brothels by the Imperial Japanese Army. They were referred to as comfort women, a euphemism for a system of wartime exploitation. Many survivors stayed silent for decades, but beginning in the 1990s, A growing number came forward, and the movement to memorialize their experience began, often led by Korean activists. The first statue was placed in Seoul in 2011, across from the Japanese embassy. Since then, replicas have been installed in over a dozen countries, including the United States, Canada, and Germany. Japan has issued several apologies and compensation agreements, most notably in 2015. But some of those deals were later criticized as being made without survivor consultation. Japanese officials have also called for the removal of the statues, viewing them as unfair and politically motivated. Each statue, typically depicting a girl in traditional Korean dress, seated and expressionless, is a statement about unresolved history and, in many places, a source of ongoing diplomatic tension. In North Korea, statues of Kim Il-sung, the country's founding leader, are not just public symbols, they are part of the state's core political infrastructure. Towering bronze statues of Kim Il-sung and later his son Kim Jong-il dominate city squares. Citizens are required to bow in front of them, and tourists are instructed to photograph the entire statue without cropping the feet, as a sign of respect. The statues are accompanied by murals, mosaics, and inscriptions, reinforcing a cult of personality that spans generations. The monuments are funded by the state and maintained with precision, even as much of the population faces economic hardship. Inside North Korea, dissent is unthinkable. Outside, the statues are seen as expressions of absolute control, built to enforce ideological loyalty. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something. There's another video on your screen right now that you should check out and enjoy. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. They really help the channel. Thanks again. See you next time.